Hello there, friends. Well, in typical better late than never style, here I am for the rest of the results for the 2024 general election. Really, this is more of a post-mortem recap type stream. We stayed up until when did we make it until on the night? Until about 5 a.m., something like that. Um, so, what were you up for Truss? They may ask one day in the future. I was not up for Truss, unfortunately, although I was delighted when I heard. No, I think it's a good time for us to come back, reconvene a week after the election. We can have a little look at the results and what exactly happened under the cold light of day. That's maybe not the phrase I'm trying to look for. Charlie Simmons has said, well, the dust has settled. That's slightly better. Well, the dust has settled. So let us have a little look. What a night indeed. Charlie and any other dear viewers out there, can you just let me know, can you hear me okay? Microphone wise, is the audio okay? Obviously, just me today. So need to be able to check. Charlie Simmons also adds, so glad Gillian Keegan lost. Without further ado, let me just fiddle around with what I've got on screen here, and I will start sharing some stuff with you. So we'll go for we'll go for the headline numbers to start with. That's as good a place as any to begin, I suppose. So, right, you guys should be able to see that. Wonderful. We also have Lee here, Lee Hallam, High Swiss, loud and clear. Badger Army says, what a night it was. And yes, I can hear you fine. Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much, guys. Okay, then. So, yes, what a night it was. Let's take a little look, shall we? So, in the end, Labour came out with 412 MPs, the Conservatives on 121. So, straight away, before anything else, before the election, we were talking about a sort of a scale of Tory defeat and Labour victory and where we ended up. And on the one end, we had sort of like total Tory annihilation, more of a Canada 93, I think it was 93 kind of situation. And then on the other hand, you have more of like a Blair landslide kind of situation. In the end, we came closer to the Blair landslide end of things. The predictions of the Tories getting less than 100 seats and all the rest of it, they didn't come to fruition. The number of seats the Tories got in the end was in the upper end of my range that I said. I had about 30 seats either way on 100 seats or so. So they sort of scrapes in that I can save a little bit of face on what I thought would happen. But yeah, it wasn't the total destruction of the Tory party. Maybe some of us got our hopes up a little bit with some of those polls in the run up to it. But nonetheless, it is most definitely the worst results the Tories have had, pretty much full stop. I don't know. Are we going back to the 1800s or the 1700s or something like that before we get anything approaching this? This is the worst time in my or your or anyone's life. This is the worst that the Tories have done. The Lib Dems, on the other hand, though, 72 seats, the best that they've ever done. They've beat their benchmark from last time round pretty nicely. I think their highest point was in the very high 50s, the low 60s. Here they are breaking through into 72. Badger Army says the SNP destruction needs to be talked about. Well, absolutely. I mean, that was there were many shocks of the night last week, to be honest with you. This was another one of them. The SNP down to 9 seats. I did not expect that. I thought even if I was going to lowball them, I would have had them on maybe about double that many seats. So that's really that's really a turnaround in fortunes. In a way, this election, in terms of fortunes, at least for the Liberal Democrats and the SNP, it's been a reverse 2015. If you think about 2015 being, the Lib Dems had just been in coalition with the Tories and were being punished for it and were thrown down to the 10 seats or so. And then the Scottish National Party, obviously off the back of the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, quite a lot of the support for the yes vote there was going to the SNP in parliamentary elections, and they got a lot of seats. They dominated Scotland, absolutely. One more party I'll talk about before we try not to get too far ahead of ourselves here. Sinn Féin, total number of seats 7. They continue to. I think they're the largest party in Northern Ireland now. I think they've over the last few years they've continued to sort of gradual sort of dominance in Northern Ireland. So it feels like we've got a gradual sort of shift. I'm not saying that we're there imminently, But if we sort of talk long term, that ultimate question of, what happens with Northern Ireland? Do they get to a situation where they want to have a border poll and decide on reunification and any of the rest of that? It's not imminent, but I think the conditions are forever gradually moving in that direction. So Badger Army had just said the death of Scottish independence. There we are, talking about Irish independence and then Scottish. Yeah, for now, yeah. I mean, I feel that that there was a window of time, maybe, that a second referendum. Not that it could have been on the cards. It's tricky because obviously, like, for example, the Tory government was never going to grant them one anyway. They kept requesting one time and time again. But there was a period of time, at least, where they had the level of support and strength that they could make a more legitimate call for a second referendum, even if it was a bit soon after the first one. Although SNP or independence types would argue that leaving the EU constitutes a material change from the circumstances they were promised remaining in the UK would leave for them if they remained in the UK last time round. So that's the debate on that issue. But yeah, I feel that this is I think this is probably for a generation now, at least. They're probably going to have to regroup and rebuild the independence movement, and it will take a while to come back. Right, I want to come back and talk about some of the main parties here and how they fared, but I will read a few comments from you guys as well. Lee Hallam says, SNP, biggest losers, unless it's Alba. What is the point of them? I was having a little look down the list of all the parties that were voted for, and Alba finished, well, I'll show you where Alba finished in a little while when we have a look, but I'm pretty sure it was like below George Galloway's Workers' Party. Fair bit lower than that. 33.7% is not the thing that long-term dominance is built on, says Lee Hallam, speaking about Labour's share of the vote. And yes, you are absolutely right. Labour have you've probably heard this phrase a lot of times in the past week or so. Labour have a very wide number of MPs and support, but also very shallow number of MPs and support. There's no denying their parliamentary majority. The fact that, for this next parliament, Labour are going to dominate. Starmer and friends can pretty much do more or less what they like. But there are a great deal of seats that they now hold, which I would say are pretty fragile to either a Tory recovery or reform continuing to grow at the expense of the Tories. Either of those things, basically. So, hang on. Hello. Sorry, that was just a weird 6 p.m. alarm on my phone. But yes, so first past the post, it's a tricky mistress, but Labour has made the wins that they've made this time round based obviously in very large part the destruction of the Tories and the Tories collapsing and the Tories being punished for all the many things that the Tories did while they were in office. But then on the flip side to that, you do have Labour. Labour have shifted themselves slightly. They've made themselves more appealing to maybe Tory type swing voters, or at the very least, this is probably perhaps more important. They've not detoxified necessarily. Here's the thing with Jeremy Corbyn, right? Because I've seen this argument being made in the wake of the election, and people are saying, "Aha! Look at this." Labour under Corbyn received more votes, not just a higher percentage vote share, but more raw votes, whatever way you want to slice it, in say 2017 than this election this time round. And that's that is absolutely true. Obviously won less seats, but I think here's the difference. When you have a figure such as Jeremy Corbyn leading the party, who is incredibly popular amongst certain parts of the electorate, very invigorating and vitalizing and giving hope and happy, warm feelings to one lot of people and bringing a large number of them out to vote for Labour. However, that exact same personality and politics for a great swathe of other voters out there in the country is just so dead set, don't want Jeremy Corbyn anywhere near power. That will bring out a whole load of other voters willing to vote for the Tories in order to stop him. And we've seen that if you want to go back and look at the previous elections, say where Corbyn was leader, yes, Labour was getting more votes, but the Tories were also getting more votes. And they were getting more votes, and they were more votes than Labour, if you follow me there. So as we'd said, it may have been in the live stream. I'm not sure when it was, but we said that Corbyn's Labour had a push and pull factor. You had both going on there as well. But ultimately, Starmer's Labour, yes, in this election this time round, not quite 10 million votes. It is remarkable, isn't it? Under first past the post, not quite 10 million votes. If you compare that to previous elections, turnout was down, of course. That's probably a fair thing to point out as well. Turnout was down, so obviously the number of votes will be less as well. But nonetheless, getting a majority of that size on a third of the votes, nearly 2/3 of the seats on a third of the votes, does expose some of the interesting workings of first past the post, doesn't it? Let me catch up on a few more of these comments from you guys here, because I realise that I'm going to get very sidetracked. There's a lot of things I want to talk about here today. What else do we have? So, freeing that the Tories get a 4 or 5 year break minimum from running the country. You and me both, Apollo. Frank, Evening Swiss, great election stream thumbnail you've got there. I'd love to talk about who made that one. Yes, Frank has sent me a thumbnail which I've applied to the stream from last week for the election. So thank you very much for that, Frank. Frank is my chief thumbnail maker on the channel these days. Lee says it's all just switching votes between two communities. Let's talk about Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin up, but SDLP down in votes, 37% between them. Unionists, 44% combined, just divided. Okay, fair point there. So I was sort of saying, signs of a movement towards Irish independence. Lee's saying, but the sort of the vote share between either camp on that issue hasn't really changed much. It's just the parties within it. Fair point. NA says, great to see you back, Swiss. We were worried about you, that absent stream from 5th of July. Yes, and I do apologise for that. I really wrecked myself staying up doing the election stream last week. So much more than I thought I would. I don't quite have the energy or stamina that I seemed to have back when I was like 23 or 24 doing this stuff, it would seem. But then I had a busy weekend planned ahead, and I had to catch up on more sleep, and before I know it, things had snowballed and I was off doing other things, and I wasn't able to come back and do this. So this has been the first day this week so far that I've kind of had everything's lined up really well for me. I've had the right amount of free time. I've had enough that I've looked into to want to reflect on the results. It seemed like a good time to come back to you. And I can say at least it was less than a week after the election, which isn't so bad, I suppose. Lee Hallam says, Alba below Yorkshire Party, I think. Reform. Now, that's an interesting story. We haven't even spoken about Reform yet, have we? We'll get on to Reform. Don't you worry. Lee Ball, Phew, glad to see you back. Starting to get paranoid that my appearance had put you off live streaming for life. Oh, you guys know me well enough at this point in time that, I'm like a cat. So I come and go as I please. But don't compare me to George Galloway when I say that I'm a cat. I regret that one already. Charlie Simmons says, if Starmer keeps momentum, what? Momentum? Hard left? Jeremy? No, all right. If Starmer keeps momentum and does some good work, I think he could improve next time, particularly if the Tories continue to shit the bed. That is a very interesting question, Charlie. Because as I've said already, the number of seats Labour have at the moment is fragile. There's an awful lot of seats they could quite easily lose the next time round. That's absolutely the case. However, you think about the fact we're on a low turnout. You think about the fact that percentage-wise, Labour got a relatively low amount versus the size of the majority that they've got. If Labour do well and govern well over the next few years, then there is absolutely the room for them to improve on how they've done. Even though you look at the majority of the size that they've got and you think, how on earth can you improve on that? But in terms of shoring up their vote share, in terms of making some of those majorities larger in some of the seats. Yes, maybe they lose a few of the seats, but they sort of solidify themselves a bit. Proof will be in the pudding. It'll be how they do over the next few years. I don't think there's an awful lot of appetite out there in the country for Labour and Starmer specifically. I think this election result has shown that. But partly, I think many people have probably either stopped paying attention to politics, or they've lost faith that anyone will be able to make positive changes in politics, or, a plethora of reasons like that. If this government governs well over the next few years, then I think they will be rewarded for it. But there's about 1 billion caveats to that we'll have to go through. let me do a few more of these comments, and then we'll continue on chatting about some of these results. Oh, one other thing I did want to say though, when it comes to Labour, when I was talking about, push and pull factors with Jeremy Corbyn and how they'd enable themselves to be a party that not so many people would vote Tory for to block them from being in power. We have also seen, though, that with Starmer's shifting of the Labour Party and sort of reorientating it within this Overton window of our politics, we have seen the push factor on some other ends as well. Most notably, I think you've had the election of the so-called Gaza independents, which are a handful of independent MPs. I think it's 4. Please do correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 4. Of independents who ran in their seats mainly on the platform of saying, we're not happy with Keir Starmer's position when he was talking about what was happening with Israel and Gaza over the few months ago, similar to sort of what George Galloway did in his by-election campaign on it, and they won their seats, which is. This is the thing. This is an election where there have been so many noteworthy and kind of jaw-dropping things that it feels as if the shine gets taken off of them if you pluck them out individually and you go, oh yeah, I suppose that's pretty interesting, but look at all the other stuff. The fact that this number of independents were elected to Parliament, it's a hell of a thing to get elected to Parliament as an independent in a non-by-election, in a general election for that matter. I don't have stats or statistics to hand for that, I'm afraid, but I can tell you basically it just don't really happen. Most certainly not if you're not already some kind of an incumbent or a defector or any of that kind of stuff. This is absolutely an election that has shown a much greater willingness amongst parts of the voting public to vote for not the main two parties. And I think in this particular instance, when it comes to these independents, it shows that Labour's kind of under threat from places where they didn't necessarily think that they'd be under threat from, if that makes sense. I think that for a long time, sort of like if you think about seats that are either inner cities or seats that have higher Muslim votes in them, they've generally been sort of pinned and nailed down where you go, yeah, that's Labour. Don't really need to worry about how that's going to go. Labour's worrying about some marginal out in the countryside with the Tories, or even trying to win back a few of their red wall areas, your Stoke-on-Trents or whatever, than what they had previously. But no, this is interesting where some of these independents have won their seats. So that is an interesting thing. I think that, again, Labour's got a big majority. They can get a lot done in Parliament, but they're not completely impervious, I think, to getting poached in the odd by-election here or there. I think it's pretty reasonable they'll get seats chipped away at them throughout the course of the next year or so. Right. Captain Swiss, one wonders what would be if it were not for the Farage effect. We possibly in hung Parliament territory and Ed Davey demanding a referendum on PR. Ironic, isn't it? Good enough time as any to come on to Reform UK. So here we have on the screen, Reform UK 5 MPs. Looked like it was going to be 4 for most of the night. And then on a recount, a 5th one just about squeezed through on 98 votes. 4 million votes. 14.3% share of the vote. They have outperformed UKIP in 2015 on basically every metric. More votes, higher vote share, more seats. So as much as we can talk about the disproportionate nature of first past the post, and believe me, I hear you. I've been saying that. It's funny, actually. In the past week, I've noticed a lot of people raging about the effects of first past the post on the election, but it seems to be. It's not the usual suspects, I suppose. Usually, it's always like small party progressive supporting types who are very unhappy with it, and everyone else is like, whatever. And now suddenly it's all the reformers going, oh, look at this PR, and I go, yeah, right. I've been saying that, but at the very least, you can say, okay, more vote share, more votes, more seats. The system I'm not going to say the system works, but at least the system moves in the right direction when certain things happen in the right direction, I suppose. Yeah. So the question being, what would the effects have been if Farage hadn't come back for reform? It would have had a huge effect. It absolutely would have, because reform wouldn't have done as well as they did. I can say that much. It was an expectation before the election. We sort of said, oh, Farage comes along, that will put a big booster rocket on reform, and they'll do far better than they would have. They'll put on a few extra percent of the vote share, maybe an extra million votes or so, whatever. That's absolutely come to pass. Would reform have got any MPs if Farage hadn't come back? Tricky to say. Tricky to say. I think I'd have to go and look at all of the reform seats and see the margins by which they won, because I'm going to have to take a decent chunk of the vote share off for what I would call the Farage effect. I don't know. It was a very variegated election. God knows with the amount of Greens and Independents and who knows what else that we've got. So I don't think it would necessarily be wise for me to say that there's no way Reform could have won any seats if Farage hadn't come back. However, I think the balance of probability absolutely stands that Farage coming back, they're a hell of a lot more likely to win 5 seats than they were under Richard Tice. So what would have happened? Well, certainly, I think that the Tory votes would have held up a little bit better. Now, Tory votes and Reform votes are not one-for-one interchangeable. There are people who have probably migrated over the course of 10, 20 years from voting Labour, maybe to UKIP or the Brexit Party, to Reform. Maybe they went to Boris Johnson's Tories in the meantime, but then they came back. This is the thing. 2019 Tory voters, there was a fair number of Tory voters in 2019 who were not long-standing Tory voters. So when we talk about where has the 2019 Tory vote gone, there was a fair enough chunk of them who voted for Boris back then that weren't actually, solid turnout, every election vote Tory types. There was an awful lot of votes lending in that election to the Tories then. So it's understandable enough that some of it peeled away easily enough when the Tories were having the misfortunes that they were. But yeah, Reform provided an alternative on the right for people to vote for if they didn't want to vote Tory. Also, it provided an alternative to the main parties if you didn't want to vote for either of them. It kind of it served a useful purpose, really. It was like part protest vote, part anti-establishment vote, part we don't think the Tories have been very good, so we're going to vote for these other guys. I'm aware, anecdotally at least, of people who have paid virtually no attention to politics before ever and came out to vote for Reform. So they've even pulled in a few new voters, I'd say, as well. But like I say, very, very strong social media game and TikTok game, Farage and Reform. I don't think that can be stated enough, really. It's something that I don't have I'm not plugged into it, I'm 30. I'm not saying there's not 30-year-olds on TikTok. There absolutely are, but I'm a bit of a boomer of my own generation. I've always had a foot more in, I'm that millennial that's kind of halfway between that and Gen Z, but I don't feel especially close to Gen Z, to be honest. Now, Farage is a lot older than me, obviously, so he's had, young people around him advising him on how to do all this stuff with TikTok and the rest of it. But it's paid dividends. It has. They had a good campaign, social media wise, certainly. Right then, so where would we? Coming back to the question once more, where would we be if Farage had not come back to lead Reform? Well, the Tories probably would have got more votes. I can't say quite how many, but I think they probably would have got more votes. It might have been worth a few percentage points. And that could well have been enough to have saved them in a fair number of seats. I don't know. I don't know. It doesn't feel smart for me to, try and put a number on this necessarily. But I suppose to answer your question, I don't think that we would have ended up in hung parliament territory if it weren't for Farage coming back to lead Reform. I think we still would have had a Labour majority. It probably would have just been, a slightly smaller Labour majority, slightly few more seats for the Tories, etc. But but I don't think we quite would have ended up in hung parliament. Admittedly, though, and it is worth saying that as far as most of the opinion polling went in the election, it was actually overstating Labour and underestimating the Tories. By and large, it was. And I suppose reform. Well, actually, no. The higher end of reform in the polling was sometimes like 19, 20% or something like that. But there was a much lower sort of core where around 15 points or so isn't too surprising. But yeah, I do think that the polling, by and large, did overestimate Labour and underestimate the Tories, which, hey ho. Well, actually, I think more so overestimated Labour. Yeah, maybe, just maybe. I mean, I think maybe there was a small handful of polls that probably you got the Labour vote share within the margin of error of those polls, but I'd say across the board, I think Labour's support was very much overstated in the polls. But hey, they still came out with the majority that they did. Right, let me do a few more of these comments here. Lee Hallam says Labour down 4% in Wales. Yes, fair point. Labour are down in Wales, probably because of some of the controversy they've had in Wales with their First Minister, I'd assume. But Labour's recovery in Scotland is what sort of like held the day for Labour, and sort of pushed their overall nationwide vote share into the positive territory. It was them recovering in Scotland, overdid them moving backwards in Wales there. Let me do a few more of these comments here. Let me see. It's quite concerning that my MP is always standing right by Luke Akehurst in photos. Should I have words? Well, it could be worse. Your MP could be Luke Akehurst. Hey! NA says, what I'm not seeing people pick up on is how male-dominated Reform is. All of its 5 MPs are men. Its leader is a man. Both of its 2 deputy leaders are men. And its chairman is a man. You do make a photo. I did actually look at a photo of all the Reform MPs before, and I went, "Oh, what's a nice bunch of upstanding white men." I was going to say middle-aged or old white men, but that's not quite true. There is one who's a young-looking guy, so it's there's even diversity within that camp. But yeah, I mean, smaller parties. I suppose you need to allow for the fact that without such a large range of without such a large number of people being elected, there's less of a chance to get sort of a variety of representation there. I mean, up until slight different example, but take the Greens, with their 1 MP, up until just recently, the Greens have only ever had 100% women in Parliament because it's only ever been Caroline Lucas. But that explanation only goes so far. I think that Reform in general does appeal more to men than it does to women. I've seen polling breakdown that says that you're more likely to vote for Reform if you are a man than if you are a woman. Perhaps then that translates to you're more likely to want to stand for Reform if you're a man than if you're a woman. You're more likely to successfully get elected for Reform if you're a man than if you're a woman. I imagine that if Reform hadn't had, I'd have to look at their list of candidates to see. I imagine it heavily skewed men, but I imagine that if Reform had elected 10, 20, 50 MPs, then you'd start to see more range in there of people, some different ethnicities, some women in there, whatever. But the sample size at the moment, I suppose the seats that they won were the seats that by and large they were best placed to win. And obviously when you've got Farage and Tice and Anderson taking up a big chunk of that, self-explanatory, I suppose. John Cooper says, I got a Labour MP for the first time since 2005, Swiss. Liberal says, oh, Mr. Ball, were you present for the drunken local stream when Swiss read from the Necrobicon and cast out a Lib Dem? I don't think you could put him off streaming. Lee says if they do well, they could up their votes and yet lose seats. Special circumstances in this election. Yes, going back to talking about Labour, perhaps you've put it into terms that I wish I'd said so well myself. They could. This is absolutely true. At the next general election, Labour could improve their vote share. They could have more people voting for them than they had before, and yet they could lose seats because, hey, first past the post. and as we've explained already, they're vulnerable in a large number of seats that they've recently won. There's a soft, squishy underbelly of seats that are just dying to go back to the Tories or be won over by Reform, and not too far off it. Labour could, swings aren't uniform. There could be areas of the country that do better in next time round and shore up some of the seats that they've gained. There will be other areas where they fall back in and Tories or Reform end up taking it. NA says 6 independents, including Corbyn. Liberalzada says 5, I think. But then NA adds, usually 0 independents get elected. Well, that's my point. That was my point, yeah. A huge number of independents elected in this election. Right, I'm just about catching up with the comments here. So what else do we have? Lee Hallam says, I think it's 5, including Corbyn. The other is an independent unionist. Okie dokie. So yes, right. So that gives him what I think it was then. So I'd sort of said 4 quote unquote Gaza independents plus Corbyn, and then indeed another one is stated here. John Cooper says Wes Streeting and Jess Phillips nearly lost their seats. Yes, they did. Obviously, we had Jonathan Ashworth poached in the election, and that was very unexpected. Labour, quite prominent Labour shadow cabinet minister there. And Wes Streeting and Jess Phillips, they came pretty close. Am I right in saying that Wes Streeting was maybe, was it like 1,000 votes or less off? I don't think Jess was too far either. Now, was Wes Streeting, did Streeting nearly lose to another independent? Was it Jess Phillips that nearly lost to the Workers' Party? We haven't spoken about George Galloway's Workers' Party yet either, have we? Let me just have a quick look here, just for my own curiosity. So let me see. Jess Phillips, Birmingham Yardley. What was our? It was the Workers' Party. So have a little look here. Jess Phillips, look at that. 11,000 votes, down 26%. Now keep in mind, this is the election that Labour just won. This is the election where Labour has a big, tasty majority in the Commons right now. Things can only get better. And yet, look at this. I mean, we saw this happen already in a number of seats that elected some independents. But here's another example, this time with Galloway's Workers' Party. Labour, 31%. Workers' Party, 29%. Look how close that is. That's about 700 votes. 700 votes between Jess Phillips and a Workers' Party MP getting elected. Conservatives down into 4th in that one. Pretty much precisely tied with the Lib Dems, both on 3634 apiece there. And look at that turnout for that matter. Turnout 50%. So yeah, this reinforces the point really, really well. With what I keep saying, which is that Labour have had a good old result in that general election. They'll be very happy with the number of MPs they've got. They've got a great opportunity to govern now, but they are fragile. They're not just fragile in places that the Tories or Reform could win back that they've won in this past election. They're fragile in places that they've held pretty much forever. But a sort of a hollowing out of their vote share in those areas, and now coming under threat by different left-wing parties or voters energized by the Gaza issue or change in the way that Muslims are voting. A range of reasons, but certainly in seats such as that, we are seeing it. That they could be in trouble. They could be in trouble. They could see their vote in some of the cities getting properly hollowed out in the next little while. This is the thing. It could be the start of a trend, and maybe it is the start of a trend. Maybe gradually over the course of the next few elections, the next decade or two, that is what we see. But at the same time, it's also possible that we could perhaps get the next election where we don't notice that trend continuing as clearly as we did before, because even though it is a trend that's on the way, maybe if Labour govern and they govern well and they're popular and they get even more votes the next time around than they got this time, then actually, even in those Jess Phillips type seats, for the next election at least, maybe they climb a little bit further back and they look a little bit safer or so. But long-term trend, maybe it's more up in the air. Right. Only 57.4 for the big two. Is promising future changes. People willing to look elsewhere, says Lee Ball. 57.4. Is that what we've got for Labour and the Conservatives added together? Oh yeah, good maths. Good maths. Yeah, I had it in my mind at around 60%, but it's actually slightly less than that. But yeah, another thing in this election that, in a way, talking about trends. Actually, this is an interesting observation. For a moment, forgets that 2017 and 2019 existed as elections. Write them off as Brexit elections. Write them off as Corbyn elections. However you want to put them, just say that they were different types of elections and different types of circumstances, and we'll cordon them off and draw a nice big bubble around them and pretend they don't exist. Now say that the most recent elections we've had are 2010, 2015, 2024. What's the trend? The trend is increasingly voters abandoning the main parties and voting in a large number of ways for all kinds of smaller parties, willing to change their vote back and forth a lot more than they ever would have done. And actually, I suppose even if we bring 2017 and 19 back into the mix, obviously they don't point to evidence of saying that people are voting for different parties per se, because the vote began to coalesce back around the main two for them ones. But it does, again, still show willingness of people to change their vote election on election. If you think about 2010, 2015, 17, 19, 24, there will be people out there who voted for the same party in all of those elections. But those people, I would say, are the minority. Genuinely, I think that less than half of the country would have consistently voted for the same party in all those years. I think that you would have had at least one or two elections where they switched and changed in the middle. I mean, Christ, yeah, I'm speaking purely anecdotally here, but I voted Labour in 2015, Labour in 2017. I voted for myself in 2019. I voted Liberal Democrat in 2024. That's quite a turnaround, I suppose. And all this from a person who would have voted Lib Dem in 2010 if I'd been able to. Right, we'll do a few more comments here. Also, Labour lost one seat and failed to get Ian Duncan Smith seat due to independence. Yes, no, IDS made it in, didn't he? I believe Labour would still win without the Farage effect, says John Cooper. I agree. I believe that Labour would have still won, even if Farage hadn't come along and helped Reform take votes off the Tories. But Labour probably won bigger as a result of that. Liberal Zardos says, in 140 seats the Tories lost, the Reform vote was greater than the gap between the losing Tory and the winning candidate. Lee Ball says, it was only confirmed that Khalid Mahmood lost his seat to the Independent when I was on my way to that buffet breakfast. I was still far too drunk and tired for. Lee Hallam says, without Farage, they would have got 7%, I reckon. No seats. Lee Anderson might have won. Speaking of Reform's fortunes there. Let me also adds, I think without Farage, Tory votes would have been 4 or 5 points higher at most, still a big Labour majority. Excuse me. Let me pivot for a moment then, guys, because we've been focusing a bit on the independents, we've been focusing a bit on Reform. Let's talk about the Greens for a moment. The Greens will be pleased, very pleased about their election night. 4 MPs up 3. You know, the Greens, for as long as my adult political memory goes back to, which is 2010, I have a few. I remember a couple of like one-ish elections before that when I was a child, but 2010 is my, you know, if the modern British state started in 1945, then my political awareness started in 2010. The Greens have always had one MP. They've always had one MP in Brighton Pavilion, and that's been it. And they've always struggled to make inroads further out there in the country than that. Obviously, they've had they've been continuing to grow pretty solidly, pretty stably, not in a Theresa May kind of way, at the local level over the last decade or so. And this election being, I think, the election where a number of things kind of helped, where you wanted the Tories out, but you weren't necessarily desperate to vote Labour in order for it to happen. More people kind of voting how they wanted to. You had a lower turnout overall. So naturally, I think that the more politically impassioned people were the ones going out to vote. And I think if you're a Green, if you're a person supporting a minor party, then probably you've got to go out and bat for your team because no one else is going to if you don't. And nearly 2 million votes as well. Again, for some reason, I keep contrasting this election with 2015. I'd said about it being sort of a reversal of fortunes for the Liberal Democrats and the SNP versus the 2015 general election. I also think that if you remember, actually, in the wake of that election, part of the narrative back then was you had the Greens and UKIP. Now let me think. How many votes did the Greens get the last time round in 2015? Was it? You know what? I'm gonna search for it just to make sure I've got my my facts correct here. So bear with me just a sec. 2015 general election results. There we are. Okay, right. So we bring this up here. 2015 general election results here. Look, you had UKIP 12.6% of the vote. You had the Greens 3.8% of the vote. So add that together. What have you got? Like 17-ish percent of the vote, something in that kind of ballpark. But in the wake of that election, you were saying, look, you had these many votes. How about in raw numbers of votes? That'll probably make the point a little bit better, actually. So where's our Green Party? Green Party 1.1 million votes. UKIP 3.8 million votes. And both of them came out with 1 MP apiece in that election. So actually, post 2015 general election, there was still a bit of a conversation about first past the post versus proportional rep. Look at all these millions of votes that these smaller parties have got, and they've only had a return of so many MPs. This time round, it's been, well, it's more of the same in a sense, really, because both the Greens and, forget UKIP, but now Reform, effectively the same thing. It's a Farage vehicle. Both of them have put on votes from last time. If you think that the Greens were 1.1 last time round, and this time they were 1.9, nearly doubled. We'll say they nearly doubled it. UKIP were 3.8 million. This time round, Reform were 4.1 million. Oh, okay. Not quite so many more votes for Reform than UKIP at the time. But then again, I suppose lower turnout versus a higher turnout in that election. So the tallies are affected by that. But my point being, post 2015 general election, you had those two parties there with about 5 million votes combined, only 2 MPs, and you sort of said, well, hang on a minute, this isn't very good. First past the post. This time round, you've got the same two parties effectively, and this time round, we'll say they had 6 million votes combined rather than 5. Except this time, rather than getting 1 MP each, one of them got 5 and the other one got 4. So I suppose actually this election has been ever so slightly less disproportionate if you're a minor party voter for the Greens or for a Farage type party. There's a better chance that you had one of them elected this time than you would have had back in that election, as disproportionate as it still is. Right, let me close those 2015 results there. But yeah, so if you're a Green, you're celebrating, you had a good time. In fact, let's do a little rundown. If you're Labour, you've had a good time. If you're a Tory, oh dear. Liberal Democrats, good time. SNP, oh dear. Reform and Greens as well, for that matter. Plaid, 4 seats, up 2 on the last election here. A slight increase in their vote share as well. So they've done well for themselves in Wales there. I'm not going to comment much on sort of like the Northern Ireland parties and the rest of it, because I'd much rather leave that to Jerry or someone if they come on the stream at some point. I can only really comment on the headline things that I see, which is the number of seats that the parties have received. Oh yeah, here we are coming down now as we get a little bit lower. So we've got our quote unquote main parties. We've also got our regional parties. We've also got our minor parties. Now I'd like to draw your attention to what I'd call the other minor parties, the really small parties. And the first amongst those is the Workers' Party of Britain. But take a look at this. Total votes, 210,000 vote share, just shy of a percentage point. It's not groundbreaking, you know, they're not fully on the radar there. This is a position that could be held by any number of minor parties potentially, but nonetheless, this is the Workers' Party of Britain. This is the number of votes that they've got. And if you compare them to, say, if you compare them to the Greens, then you go, okay, fair enough. Workers' Party got like 10% of the vote that the Greens got. Are they really on the radar that much? But compare their vote share with obviously some of the again, I'm hard tuned to looking at things in this first past the post PR kind of way at the moment. But compare it to say traditional unionist voice in Northern Ireland. 1 MP elected, total votes just shy of 50k. Well, Workers' Party got over 4 times that much. Workers' Party got Plaid got 4 MPs on less votes than the Workers' Party got as well. So the Workers' Party are out there. They just couldn't quite consolidate their vote enough in certain areas to yield MPs. But I'll tell you what, they were close. They were pretty close. Like when we looked at Jess Phillips' seat there. Wasn't too much in it. The Social Democratic Party, oh my baby. How did they do? Up 0.1%. Total votes 33,000. I don't think they stood in that many seats, to be honest. So that probably is going to harm your chances there. And the Yorkshire Party as well. Again, unlikely to have stood in that many seats. What with them being the Yorkshire Party, I suppose. And then going further down, Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition. There's Alba. We were wondering where Alba was. Where did they end up? Well, Alba got 11,000. Wow, 11,000 votes. That's like less votes than certain candidates got in individual seats. Yeah, Alba's not really a thing, is it? I mean, I suppose this hasn't really been the election if you're a person backing Scottish independence. One might have assumed, the SNP get a huge kicking, maybe some of that vote goes to Alba instead. Doesn't seem to have happened that way, I suppose. Oh, and rejoin the EU. Yeah, woo. And then I'm just gonna continue to scroll down here without comment, just to you know, in the interest of balance and fairness, to show you some of these other parties and their the fact that they're there. You know, well, the Hampshire Independents, the Communist Party. Well, yeah, 2,600 votes for the old commies. All right then. A few more comments. Let's have a little look. No Lib Dem or Green tactical vote for Jess Phillips then. No, not by the looks of that. NA says, my Brexiteer granddad also voted Lib Dem like you, Swiss. Apparently it was the result of going eeny, meeny, miny, mo when he got to the ballot paper. Well, we ended up in the same camp, albeit for slightly different reasons, I assume. Reform say they will probably copy Paddy Ashdown's local government strategy, plus devolved parliament. 16% in Wales, 7% in Scotland would get seats in both. I think Greens have about 2% of their voters of true believers. The others are just far left people looking for a home. Corbyn took them to Labour, Starmer not so much. Hate to say it, but Greens have been boosted by pro-Gaza vote in certain areas. Can they count on that going forwards? And if so, is that a good thing? I mean, certainly as you know, left-wing alternative to Labour. I mean, I'll put it this way, if you like. I would probably rather the Greens benefiting from left-wing votes peeling away from Labour or anger over the Gaza issue. I'd rather the Greens benefiting from that than, say, Galloway's Workers' Party benefiting from that. I'd rather the Green-esque left-wingers in Parliament than more Galloway-esque left-wingers in Parliament, as a personal preference. Guys, I am really sorry to say, but I am going to need to go. I am. I've ran out of time. I've got somewhere that I need to be tonight. I'm going to be watching the England game. I don't feel that I've quite got to the bottom of everything that I wanted to say about the general election results here. So I may be Mac. I may be Mac. Well, I thought I was Swiss. I may be back. There may be more in the coming days with more to discuss. But at the very least, I think we've managed to cover, you know, the main party's fortunes, who's up, who's down, by how much, all the rest of it. But there's doubtless more to talk about because it was a very interesting election indeed. All right then, guys. So thank you very much for joining me for this evening. Enjoy your evening. If you're watching the England game, have fun. I'll catch you all later on. Ta-ta.